One of these things is not like the others. One of these things doesn't belong. Can you tell
It's
which
the boot,
thing
if you didn't.
is not
the
like
boot.
the other by the time I finish this song?
I don't know why, but as a kid, I loved that segment of Sesame Street. Like, I loved looking at the screen, and I would shout at the TV, like, it's the boot, or whatever. I just would, I don't know why. And this was like the shortest one I could find. Most of them are like 3.5 minutes. Like, I don't know what kind of depth perception problems you have to have that it takes 3.5 minutes to figure it out, but there's 3 cookies on the plate, not 2. I don't know what it is, but I love that. Just this, and then my kids ended up liking that segment too, of being able to distinguish the different things. When it comes to human beings and looking different or being different, we're an odd kind of group, aren't we? I mean, on the one hand, we kind of like to stand out a little bit. Like, we like to have like the coolest outfit or the new hip hairstyle or the latest product, some cool gadget or product. Like, to some degree as human beings, we can stand out that way, but we don't want to stand out too much. Like, we still want to dress like our peers or act like our peers. So there's this tension about how different we should look among other people. Sometimes we press that out, and we want to have our own identity, but most times we just want to blend in. Like, we don't want to stick out too much, right? I mean, that's how most human beings are. Well, when it comes to following Jesus, we're actually supposed to stick out to some degree. The boot is still a shoe, right? It's a form of a shoe, but it's different. So we're still human beings, but there's a qualitative difference about Jesus people's lives than non-Jesus people's lives, or at least they're supposed to be. I mean, think of this one. I think I've used this the last couple of weeks, but I'll just reiterate it. Jesus would say things like, when you throw a party, don't just invite the people you like, invite people nobody else would invite. Because if you just invite the people you like, then you're no different than the pagans. There's supposed to be a qualitative difference about our lives. We treat people, we interact with people from different social classes or economic or educational backgrounds. Like, we're supposed to be the people who invite everybody to the table. He says crazy stuff like, love your enemies. Like, hey, do that, you're going to stand out, right? I mean, you're going to stand out if you love your enemies. Jesus calls us to be distinguishable among other people. Now, I have to admit this, I actually think about this quite a bit in my life, particularly when I'm hanging out with people outside of our church body. So if I'm doing something in the community, sometimes my work with the church takes me to working with the schools, or there's some government things that I'll attend or go to, and or I think about like stuff at my kids' schools when I'm hanging out with other parents from my children's schools, or if it's sports teams we're on and we're hanging out with parents from sports teams. And I think often, like, is there anything that distinguishes me from the rest of the people that are here? Like, sometimes I think, well, I'm nice, most of the time, and humble. But I'm nice. But frankly, most of the people I hang out with at my kids' events and parents who don't go to church anywhere else, they're nice too. I think, well, I'm joyful. I mean, I'm pretty funny most of the time. And I think, well, a lot of people I hang out with are joyful too. And I really think about that. I think about, like, is there any qualitative difference in my life that allows me to stand out among people who don't know Jesus? Now, I'm not talking about being holier than thou. I think that actually is not a great quality. I'm not talking about being judgmental, and I don't think that's a part of it. But there should be some qualitative difference from our lives that people go, one of these people is not like the other, that there's just something there that they're drawn to. They ought to say, that person looks different. They spend their time different, or they do friendships different, or they do marriages different, or they raise their kids different, or they spend their money differently. There's something different about them. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but there's some qualitative difference to their life. What is that? Researcher George Barna wrote a book in 1998, and then he redid the study in 2007. And what he was doing is he was measuring people who claim to be Christians and people who claim not to be Christians. He was looking at their behaviors. I mean, he looked at attitudes, he looked at workplace gossip, he looked at television viewing habits, I mean, on down the line, the rate of divorce, I mean, all these different things. And when the project was said and done, he could not find very many statistical differences, behavior or attitude-wise, between those who claimed to follow Jesus and those who didn't. It was like statistical ties on almost every one of the markers. Now, some people poo-pooed his study and said, well, you didn't really try to figure out who was really a Christian. It was just the people who claimed to be Christians. And he said, well, that kind of proves my point that somehow we have set up a definition of Christian in our country that doesn't require some kind of attitude or behavioral change or transformation, that you could claim that title and not be different than anybody else. There should be something that distinguishes us as believers in Jesus. What would distinguish us as followers of Jesus? How should a disciple, a student of Jesus, stand out? Now, Jesus' own disciples had trouble with this at times, of what should distinguish their lives. You can go ahead and turn to Mark chapter 9. We'll eventually get there. But if we've been going through Mark this year at different points and really just pointing out what does it mean to be a disciple of Christ. We started in early in the year with kind of a series on just like it means to be a follower of Jesus. Jesus says, follow me, and then you get your first assignment right then. Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men and women. Like the very first thing we're supposed to do is follow Jesus, learn how to do life if he was doing our life, and then at the same time invite other people into this relationship with Jesus. And so this is what we're to be doing as disciples. And so we've just pressed out the last few months, mainly in the spring. I don't think we did much in the summer, but mainly in the winter and the spring. We looked through Mark chapters 1 through the beginning of 9, just what does it mean to be a disciple, a reproducing disciple of Jesus. Well, we're looking at the Bible now because these are the inspired words of God on the page, but it's also these events actually happened. And Jesus is going to teach us over the next few weeks out of Mark 9 and Mark 10 the qualitative differences that should be in a believer's life, what should distinguish us. These guys, his disciples, struggled with this in the beginning. In the beginning of 9, if you read Mark this week, that was one of our assignments from last week, or if you remember the teachings that we've done this year, there's a little boy that has a demonic issue. He's demonized, and they're going to try to cast this demon out, and the disciples can't. And Jesus is like, you little faiths, you just what's wrong with you? And so he rebukes them for that. Later in Mark 9, they actually meet a guy who can cast out demons in Jesus' name, and they rebuke him and say, hey, you're not part of the 12, you're not part of our posse, and so you just stop it. And Jesus, like when he hears this, he's like, why are you doing that? They argue about who is the greatest, which is a little funny because there's so many failures in Mark 9 of these disciples, and yet they're arguing which is the greatest. And Jesus says, man, you're not here to be great. You're here to be humble and to serve. And my kingdom is an upside-down kingdom. And so they fail at that. Jesus launches off of the part where he says, when they tell him about they've rebuked a guy for casting out demons in his name, he launches off of that, and he says, listen, you have to be careful. He says, if you cause a little child who is following me, if you cause them to stumble and to renounce their faith, it would be better if a millstone was tied around your neck and you were thrown into the ocean. That's pretty serious. I don't know if you ever had a millstone tied around your neck, thrown in the ocean, but that's bad stuff. Then he just continues pressing that out, and he says, and then in your own life, if there are things in your life that are going to drag you to the fires of hell, it's just best to get rid of them than to be in hell. And he takes some pretty drastic measures in that talk. He says if your hand causes you to sin, better to cut it off and walk into heaven with a bloody stump on the end of your arm than to go to hell with both hands. And I don't think he's literally wanting us to do that because, hey, let's face it, we could gouge our eyes out and gouge our ears out and our hands, and we're still pretty cruddy people on our heart. I don't know that that's an effective way at transformation. But the point he was trying to make is take drastic measures to make sure you're following me and not ending up in the fires of hell. He then pivots from the word fires of hell, and he starts talking about a different kind of fire, and he changes metaphors to salt, and he begins to talk about the saltiness of disciples and what should distinguish a disciple's life from a non-disciple's life. Take a look at verse 49 with me. Mark 9, verse 49. Everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can you make it salty again? Have salt among yourselves and be at peace with one another. Jesus moves from talking about hellfire, people and folks that will be rejected, to then he begins to move towards his disciples who you all have already been accepted by Jesus. You're following Jesus, and that he's moving and he's going to drill into their life. He's going to press into their life, and he's still using the fire thing. He's saying, all of you, everyone here, you're going to be salted with fire. And it's the salt that's going to make you distinguishable among other people. Now, instead of just saying what distinguishes us as disciples, I've named this series Salty Disciples. Now, when I say salty disciples, I'm not like, talking about some of your grandmas. She's pretty salty. You should have heard the words coming out of her mouth, Grandpa used to say, you kiss mama with that mouth. We're not talking about that kind of salty, We're talking about how Jesus uses the word salt in that it's some qualitative distinguish. Some of you are like, you knew my grandma? That's exactly how she was. No. He's talking about the qualitative difference about our life, and he's using the metaphor of salt. He says, in the beginning, everyone is salted with fire. And you go, what does that mean? What a trick in learning what these things mean is two things. What did the original hearers hear when Jesus said these words? What did they think of when they heard the words? So if you're going to find out what it means today, you got to figure out what it meant back then. Context is important. And then not only what the original hearers heard when Jesus spoke it, but then it was inspired to be written down. And when the book of Mark was written and passed around, what did the original readers hear when they read it? And so the original hearers that when Jesus spoke most probably thought of an image, because this was a common phrase about salting with fire. It was a part of the temple in Jerusalem, which all these people would have been at one time or another in their life. And when a sacrifice, a bull or a lamb, was put on the fire, and it was a way of paying for their sins, that because they sinned, something had to pay, and it was a way to say, okay, I'm paying for my sins. And back then, animals were really money. They didn't carry a ton of money. It was your property. They were giving their best, and they were saying, this living thing is paying the price for my sin. Because if we're honest, when we sin, living things around us pay that price, right? And it was a shadow of when Jesus would come and pay for our sins. But when they would put the meat, they would butcher the meat, they'd put the meat on the altar and give it to God. They would just burn it up in its entirety and just devote it to God. Before they would do it, they would sprinkle some salt on the sacrifice, and it would be salted, they would say, with fire and with salt. When Jesus uses salt in that kind of a way as a metaphor, he's saying, I think, like a sacrifice was seasoned for God and offered up as something pure to God, he's now saying that as we follow Jesus, we're to be a purified sacrifice. That part of what distinguishes us is our life ought to have the salt of holiness on it. That there ought to be a purifying effect when we have a relationship with Jesus. Do you remember what Paul said in Romans 12? Some of you remember that, right? He says, don't be conformed to the patterns or the mold. Don't let yourself be pressed into this culture's mold, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And right before that, he says, here is your spiritual act of worship, that you should be living sacrifices before God. You're being salted. You're a sacrifice. You're to be purified. Now, sometimes the purification fires are God. It's like God comes into your life and convicts you, and you're like, I got some stuff I got to take care of. Other times, the fires don't necessarily come from God. Mark wrote his book probably in the early 60s, 60 AD in the first century. And it was written, most people believe, as a memoir of sorts of Peter's recollections of following Jesus. And then it was sent to the capital of the empire, Rome, where the early church was. And Roman believers were reading this. In the 60s, Nero was cranking up the persecution of Christians. He was putting the heat on them, sometimes quite literally. He would put them in the fire, tie them to a stake. Others were imprisoned, others were beaten. Some were not allowed to buy food at the marketplace because when you went to the market, you were supposed to give a pinch of incense towards Caesar and say, Caesar is Lord, and they would say, no, only Jesus is Lord. And they wouldn't be allowed to buy food. My guess is when those early believers that read Mark for the first time read that everyone is salted by fire, they realized, yeah, we're getting persecuted right now by some fire. And yet God can use suffering and even persecution for our benefit, to purify us. Take a look at what Peter would later say, who Peter heard these words when he was with Jesus, but now he writes to the people in Rome. 1 Peter 1, 6-7. We'll just put it on the screen, that way you don't have to turn there. In all this you greatly rejoice, though for a little while, you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is being revealed. You see, a salty disciple is a disciple who's being purified. I don't think God causes the suffering. I think somehow in his grand plan he can orchestrate what Satan means for evil. God can twist and reverse it and use it for our good. And Peter says in these verses, that's exactly what was happening to those believers in Rome. They were being salted by fire, trials of all kinds, persecuted. And yet God was taking what the enemy wanted to use to snuff their life out. God was using it to purify them. We'll press this out in a couple weeks because later in Mark 10, Jesus talks about he has a cup of suffering that the Father has given him. He says the same thing at Gethsemane, John 18, that there's a cup of suffering that came from the Father that he had to drink. There are times in our lives and there are things we learn when we go through persecution and trials and hardships, and we can either say the enemy's having victory and he's going to snuff my life out, or we can approach it and say, I don't think God likes suffering. I don't think he wants his church persecuted. I don't think he loves diseases. Those aren't from the hand of God. But God is so big and so powerful, he can twist what the enemy wants to use to snuff me out, and he can use it to purify me. Are you a salty disciple? Are you being purified right now? Is there like one sin you could think of that God wants to purify you from this week? Like, just think for a few moments. Is there one sin you think, I need to be a living sacrifice. I need to be salted with fire. I need to be a sacrifice pleasing to God. And there's this one area I need to surrender to Jesus this week. Well, salty disciple goes beyond that. Take a look at 49 again. Everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can you make it salty again? Have salt among yourselves. Be at peace with one another. Salt is good. There was a maxim in the ancient world. I was reading one commentator on this passage, and he was saying that some philosopher had said the world would not exist if it were not for salt. And the reason was because without refrigeration, salt was incredibly important. It preserved life. It preserved food. Think about salt cures ham, so that you don't have to refrigerate ham or jerky or bacon or different things that you can cure it. You can put enough salt on it, and it preserves life in it so that you won't get sick from it. Jesus says salt is good. He talks about in Matthew 5:13 that we're the salt of the earth as followers of Jesus. We've been sprinkled out onto the earth. And one of the metaphors he's using there, because he's using the metaphor of salt, one of the implications is you and I are sprinkled throughout this world to preserve life. We have a culture of death, don't we? Left to its own devices, the world will just kill relationships. We kill people. We have no problems just starting wars indiscriminately. You know, we have abortion. We have talks about euthanasia. You think about murder rates. You think about a place. I was talking to one person that was in Chicago a few weekends ago, and the weekend they were in Chicago, over the 3-day weekend they were there, 65 people were shot. That's a culture of death. We just indiscriminately take life. Yet you and I, if you're a follower of Jesus, we're supposed to be sprinkled throughout the world in order to preserve life. Like we bring a qualitative difference to the world. I was thinking about this, that we remind the world of what's wholesome and good and life-giving. Just think about this. I wrote a few notes last night. I was thinking about this again, is you think about, because oftentimes we think, well, if Jesus said he's bringing the kingdom and he's bringing life and abundant life, I just don't see much life around me. And I get that because we're just inundated with death. But just think about, since the time of Jesus and to now, how disciples have salted the earth with life. Like, you know, hospitals exist because of believers. Like there wasn't hospitals until believers. I mean, you think about Riverside United Methodist Hospital, Mount Carmel Catholic Hospital. Well, that was Christians hundreds of years ago that began pushing that out. You know, orphanages? Orphanages were started by believers. I mean, orphan children before that just kind of left on the street to die or fend for themselves. It's Christians who start orphanages. You think of public education. The reason there's a public education system is because Christians in England and America in the late 1700s, early 1800s began to press out that everybody needs a basic level of education. You think of women's right to vote. You think that was started by believers in America in the late 1800s. You look at any abolition movement around the world, and I have yet to find one that was started by unbelievers. It's believers in Jesus that start that. You think of the great push right now to end human trafficking because of our great quest, how we have corrupted God's gift of sex, and our quest for pornography has fueled a human trafficking movement. And yet it is believers who have started the anti-trafficking movements, trying to rescue people. I mean, that could go on and on. NA, AA, both started by believers. Food pantry. Think of universities. I mean, the whole university system started by believers, by Catholic monks, by people like St. Ignatius, who set some record of starting, I can't even remember now, like something like 50 universities in the first 60 years of the Ignatian movement. I mean, these Christians did this. We're adding life. Food pantries, we're salty disciples, we preserve life. Are you a salty disciple? Are your behaviors and your word around you, are you preserving life, or are you adding to the rot in this world? We should be known as, what should distinguish us is that we preserve life. Right alongside of that is salt not only purifies and preserves, it also enhances flavor. We pour salt on food in order to promote the flavor of the food, to enhance it, to bring out the flavor. In salty disciples, we promote the flavor of life in other people. Matthew 5:14 says, we're like the light of the world. We're a city on a hill. Nobody lights a lamp and then covers it up. You light a lamp so everybody can see it. And he says, you are the salt of the earth. And Jesus says, so let your good deeds shine so other people could see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. There's to be a qualitative difference in the life of believers where we operate, we talk, our attitudes, our actions, our works, our deeds. They're distinguishably different from other people, and it actually enhances their life. Like they want to be around us. We promote life in people. Like the believers in the room at any workplace, they should not be the Eeyores in the room. You ever met Eeyore people? Yeah. We're called to lift people up. We're called to enhance life, to promote life in people. We're to speak words of life. Do you remember that? When Jesus at one point, he was going to Jerusalem, and the disciples are like, I guess we got to go too. You know, we're going to go there and die. And A bunch of disciples had left Jesus. They'd peeled off because he'd said some challenging words about drinking his blood and eating his flesh, which that's a real party killer if you start talking like that. And a bunch of disciples left, and Jesus goes, "Are you guys going to leave too?" Remember what Peter said? Peter said, "Where would we go? You have the words of what? Life." Like, we should be the people in the room that bring life to people. We speak words of hope and encouragement. Kind of need that this season, right? Not a lot of words of hope and life, are they? Probably not going to hear a lot of life tonight at a certain debate, right? What if we were the people who brought life to the room, life to people? In a world full of sarcasm and cynicism that just depletes hope, what if we were the people who talked about life? Are you enhancing other people's lives? Are you a salty disciple? Are you enhancing and promoting life in other people? I would just encourage you, if you want to put it into practice, this week, pick 2 days where you just say, "I'm not going to speak anything discouraging." I'm not telling you to lie. I mean, don't lie. If you just got to be silent, then just be silent. But what if you just said, "I'm going to pick 2 different days this week where I'm just going to promote life in others"? I think, Romans 12:10 says something along the lines of honor others above yourself. What if you just promoted honor in other people? Promoted life in other people? I give you that challenge. See what would happen in your home. See what would happen in your neighborhood or your school or workplace or college. If you just said, "I'm going to just, around my friends, just see what happens." What they do. I had a friend, I have a good friend, a pastor friend, and he was visiting somebody. He was on a long motorcycle trip, and he was visiting a friend, and this friend had adult children, and every time one of the adult children happened to be in town visiting, every time one of the adult children walked in, they walked right over to their dad. Their dad got up and gave him a giant hug and said, "Man, I'm so proud you're my son or my daughter." Every single time. Gave him a kiss on the cheek, and then would go on and on about him. And my friend noticed that every time one of the kids walked in the room, the first thing they did is they went straight to the father. And he would stand up and do that same thing. Life is addicting, isn't it? So my friend said, I'm gonna practice that in my home. Practice it with he had late teenagers, early 20-somethings, and he practiced it for a few weeks, and then it set in. And now every time his kids, if he's at the office and they walk, every time they just walk right in, and they're just like a magnet to their father. And he just speaks words of life and gives them a hug. That's different, isn't it? You don't get that everywhere, do you? I think you're supposed to. I think disciples of Christ are supposed to salt people with life, sprinkle life on them. There's another way that Jesus says salty disciples stand out. Take a look again. Start with verse 50. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can you make it salty again? Have salt among yourselves and be at peace with each other. Have peace among yourselves. Have salt among yourselves. Pass the salt. Share the salt is how one translation puts it. Share salt among yourselves. Like when you picture that, share salt among yourselves, you can just picture kind of the vision, the image there is like of a meal. And hey, will you pass the salt? And Jesus says, well, this sharing of the salt is have peace among yourselves. One of the distinguishing marks of a salty disciple is they're at peace with other believers. Are you a salty disciple? Is there another believer in Jesus that you don't have peace with right now? I would encourage you to pray this week and say, Jesus, I want to be a salty disciple. I want to put this into practice. I'm going to pray for that person that I'm at odds with every day this week. And I'm going to ask you, would you show me, Jesus, one step I could take to make peace with that believer? It might be a believer who's in this church. It might be somebody that's outside the church, but they're a follower of Jesus, and yet you don't have peace with them. Salty disciples are at peace with each other. Now, disciples are distinguished by our saltiness, we've learned. They're being purified. We preserve life. We promote life in other people, the flavor of life in other people, and we live at peace with one another. Purification, preserving life, bringing out the true flavor of life, living in peace are all what distinguishes disciples of Jesus from everyone else. That's our salt. And yet right here in verse 50, Jesus said, but if it loses its saltiness, how can you make it salty again? Some of you remember the more famous passage that talks about salt, Matthew 5:13. Jesus says, if salt loses its saltiness, it's worthless, and what should happen to that salt? What's it say? Do you remember? It's thrown out, yes. Because just think about it. If you have salt, and you put it into your recipe, and you pick the salt up and you taste it, and it doesn't taste like salt, then what's it good for? That was mainly sugar. There was a little salt in there. Don't do that if you have blood pressure problems. I'm feeling good now. But seriously, if you bought this, you took it home, you poured it into a recipe, or you put it in this, you sprinkle it on your food, and it doesn't add to the flavor, what's it good for? What do you use bad salt for? Nothing. There's no good use for it, is there? See, Jesus is trying to tell us something. He's trying to say, hey, this is what it means to be a disciple, that we are distinguished from other people in the world. And if we lose our saltiness and we're indistinguishable from anybody else, then I'm not sure we're a disciple at all. That true followers of Jesus have some qualities about their life that add to the flavor of the world, that allow their own life to be purified, that promotes flavor in other people, and that promotes peace among people. How do you apply this to your life? Well, I've kind of sprinkled, no pun intended, sprinkled applications throughout the teaching. 1, what's one sin that Jesus wants you to purify you from this week? 2, pick 2 days this week and speak only life-enhancing words to the people in your life. 3, if you're at odds with another believer, take this week to pray for that person and ask God for your first step in making peace with them. And now add a 4th. You plan on being here for this series. We're starting a series. We're going to be looking at Mark 10, and Mark 10 lists out several behaviors and actions of believers that say, this is what distinguishes, like here's how the world operates, and here's how a Jesus follower operates. And so we're going to talk about being salty disciples over the next few weeks together. A disciple who loses their saltiness is indistinguishable from a non-disciple, but a salty disciple is being purified, preserves and enhances life, and lives at peace. Are you a salty disciple? Let's go ahead and stand up for worship. I'm going to have the worship team come up. And as they're coming up and they're getting ready, I just want to pray over us. Jesus, thank you for this word. Lord, I pray right now that even as we come into your presence through worshiping through music, that your presence would begin to purify us. We would be set apart as a people, that we would look differently than the rest of the world, not as a holier than thou thing, not as bragging rights, but we want to look differently because this world needs people who act and live differently because we're pretty broken. We need life. We need your life to be poured into us, and then we want to be sprinkled out into this community and to bring life to this community. Like we just declare we are tired of brokenness, broken relationships, tired of just the enemy using addictions to quite literally kill people. We're tired of people going after what the world says is the good life, and it just leaves them empty and tired and fatigued. We want to bring life to places, but we can't do that on our own. We need filled up with you. And then we'll go out and we'll be like salt being shook out of this shaker called the vineyard. We'll be shaken into this community, bringing life preserving life, promoting life, having our own life purified so we might look more like you, being at peace with one another. We come to worship you. In the strong name of Jesus, I pray.